California Task Force to study and develop reparation proposals for African Americans. Content warning. It contains discussions of racial discrimination, sexual assault, torture, lynching, and other forms of extreme violence. Contains unedited historical quotations and photographs of white supremacist hatred, torture, lynching, autopsy, and other forms of graphic violence.
Chapter 11. An Unjust Legal System. 7. Discrimination in the Civil Justice System. The civil legal system is an especially important part of the legal system in the United States because it is the system through which Americans can solve common and ordinary problems. Americans must use the civil legal system to solve everyday problems in nearly every area of life, such as family law, housing, health, finances, employment, government services, wills and estates, and education. Nationwide, approximately 47% of Americans experience at least one civil legal problem in their household each year. 413. Unlike in the criminal justice system, there is no constitutional right to counsel in all types of cases in the civil legal system, but a lawyer is crucial to prevailing in any civil case. Historically, African Americans have experienced discrimination in the civil legal system nationwide, and in California, American government and its citizens have used the civil legal system to subjugate African Americans during and after slavery. For an in-depth discussion of the impact of the civil legal system on labor and employment rights, see Chapter 10, Stolen Labor and Hindered Opportunity. African Americans today continue to face numerous barriers in access to civil justice, including lack of resources and access to courts, and lack of diversity in the legal profession. Systemic barriers. The U.S. Supreme Court notoriously held in Dred Scott v. Sanford that African Americans, whether enslaved or free, were not citizens of the United States and therefore did not have the rights and privileges of the U.S. Constitution. 414. After slavery ended, many federal civil decisions harmed African Americans, such as cases that legalized segregation. 415. That prevented the federal government from outlawing racial discrimination by private citizens. 416. And that protected the economic liberties of white Americans over the civil rights of African Americans. 417. Further, in many states throughout the country, African Americans could not testify in a case in which a white person was a party. 418. These government actions that occurred after slavery ensured African Americans remained in the lowest caste of the American racial hierarchy. Evidence exists that African Americans' negative past experiences with the criminal justice system contribute to resistance to seeking help from the civil legal system. 419. One study has shown that black claimants are underrepresented in federal court cases and white claimants are overrepresented. 420. Members of historically marginalized communities, including African Americans, have long faced difficulties accessing justice due to systemic problems like underfunding. 421. Underfunded courts have reduced hours and staff, resulting in case delays and a decreased ability to provide services, such as resources for litigants without lawyers. These problems particularly affect people with low incomes, who are disproportionately black. According to the Legal Services Corporation, which Congress created to provide attorneys to low-income Americans, approximately 21% of people who have family incomes that are below 125% of the federal poverty line identified as black in 2016. 422. In that same year, approximately 71% of low-income households experienced at least one civil legal problem, which included issues with domestic violence, veterans benefits, disability access, housing conditions, and healthcare. 423. Americans with low incomes received inadequate or no legal help for 86% of their civil legal problems in 2016. 424. Lack of diversity in the legal profession. Historically, law schools and bar associations have discriminated against African Americans by preventing their entry into law schools and the profession. 425 is discussed in Chapter 6, Separate and Unequal Education. Predominantly white graduate schools like law schools routinely excluded African Americans until the 1960s. 426 The American Bar Association, the main profession association of attorneys in the United States, prohibited African Americans from joining until 1943. 427 Black lawyers founded the National Bar Association instead. 428 Chapter 10, Stolen Labor and Hindered Opportunity, provides an in-depth discussion of racial discrimination against African Americans by professional guilds and licensure process. The American Bar Association initially rescinded the membership of William H. Lewis in 1912. The first black assistant U.S. Attorney General and two other black men because leaders determined that they had elected him, in ignorance of material facts, and that, the settled practice of the association has been to elect only white men as members. 429. Scholars also argue that the bar exam, the licensure exam for lawyers, is culturally biased against and designed to exclude historically marginalized groups, like African Americans. Nationwide, in 2020, African Americans comprised 8% of students in law schools, but only about 5% of lawyers, even though they were 13.4% of the country's population. Today, scholars argue that the law school admissions test and law school accreditation continues this discrimination. 430 Scholars also argue that the bar exam, the licensure exam for lawyers, is culturally biased against and designed to exclude historically marginalized groups, like African Americans nationwide. In 2020, African Americans comprised 8% of students in law schools, but only about 5% of lawyers. 431, even though they were 13.4% of the country's population. 432 Only 66% of African Americans passed the 2020 bar examination on their first attempt nationwide, which is the lowest passage rate when compared to other racial groups. 433. As a result, African Americans are underrepresented in the national legal profession and federal judiciary. These statistics have remained almost unchanged since 2011. 434 nationwide. In 2020, African Americans comprised 9.8% of federal judges, even though African Americans make up 13.4% of the population. 435. In general, lawyers in the legal system are particularly important as the pivotal role in the preservation of society. 436 An officer of the legal system and a public citizen have special responsibilities for the quality of justice. 437 Scholars argue that a law degree is a springboard to lucrative and powerful careers, which are closed off to many African Americans. 438 Advocates argue that black attorneys provide black litigants and defendants with much needed and effective culturally appropriate legal services. 439. California. These same issues exist in California. Much like California criminal courts, the state's civil courts have been historically underfunded. 440 Which leads to many conditions that result in inadequate resources for the public, such as limited services for self-represented litigants, decrepit facilities, and limited court staff. As a result of underfunded courts, civil cases move slowly and cases are often not resolved for years. The COVID-19 pandemic, which caused statewide court closures and resulted in continuances of hearings and trials, has also further lengthened the time it takes for civil cases to resolve. 441 Approximately 55% of Californians experience at least one civil legal problem in their household each year. 442 But according to the State Bar of California, 85% of Californians received no or inadequate legal help for their civil legal problems. 443 People with low incomes, many of whom are black, struggle with problems related to housing, health, finances, employment, family law issues, disability benefits, and many other civil law issues. 444. California has passed laws that provide for counsel in certain civil cases, like those involving family law issues. 445. But, overall, in the vast majority of civil cases, there is no right to counsel both nationwide and in California. Some studies show that African Americans, in particular, face unique impediments in obtaining access to a lawyer. 446. One study showed that those with black-sounding names receive one-half the callbacks of those with white-sounding names in response to calls for legal representation. 447. Although African Americans are not underrepresented in the California judiciary, they are underrepresented in the statewide legal profession. In 2020, 8% of judges were black. 448. In California, during 2019, African Americans comprised 4% of lawyers even though they comprise 6% of the population in the state. 449. These numbers have remained stagnant in the last 30 years. 450. While this lack of diversity presents a problem for creating trust in both the criminal and civil legal system, it is especially problematic for African Americans because it is the system through which they can address the discrimination they continue to experience, as this report discusses across all of its chapters. Individuals with black-sounding names receive half the callbacks of those with white-sounding names in response to calls for legal representation. 392. Chapter 11. An Unjust Legal System. 8. Conclusion. Rooted in the tools to maintain slavery, social control of African Americans continued through American history as the Black Codes and segregation laws. Federal and state governments continue the legacy of slavery by criminalizing African Americans. Today, California court cases and statutes contributed to a national body of law that explicitly discriminated against African Americans as a result of legalized discrimination against African Americans. The American general public developed and perpetuated biases and stereotypes against African Americans. American politicians capitalized on these racist stereotypes to win office and implement more laws and policies that have imprisoned more African Americans than white Americans compared to their shares in the population. This ensured that African Americans remained in the lowest caste of the American racial hierarchy. Much like in the criminal justice system, the effects of slavery in the civil legal system have caused African Americans to experience significant inequities. African Americans, particularly those with low incomes, experience numerous barriers in the underfunded court systems, both nationwide and in California, that prevent them from accessing justice in civil courts.